So thank you to our speakers for speaking. We've now got time for questions, and we'll have microphones which will be on the aisles. And if you could please introduce yourself and your affiliation to us as you speak, that'd be fantastic. I might just bring out the house lights again so we can actually see who's talking out there. But look, it's interesting. We had a lot of discussion around the need for, I suppose, looking at global reach of commercialising technologies. You know, we all recognise Australia as a small market, and Robert, you've had personal experience of the need to look to overseas markets to expand the viability. But I just wonder, is the challenges of, I suppose, and I might direct this question to you, Jared, just in terms of your review paper initially, the observation, do we need to perhaps think differently in Australia about how we might approach our investment and development technologies, because we are a small market, and we have to think globally, where we basically can't operate like the US. But perhaps what's your learnings from New Zealand? I'm particularly keen to understand your learnings from New Zealand, which is a small country. So what have they done differently that's given them an ability to, I suppose, see more commercial potential?
Sure, yeah. So firstly, I just want to say, I think Robert brought up great points about the advantages of the US, but I think I could have also highlighted some Australian advantages as well, in that Australian ag is world-renowned. Some folks may here know this, but I certainly didn't before getting into this, is that Australian ag is more difficult, it's less supported by the government than elsewhere, and they're just more rugged. And so if something makes it here, especially in ag tech, it can make it anywhere. So that's a major advantage to Australia. And then in terms of the sort of disadvantages Robert was talking about, Australia, I came out here to, my first research report was on the US-Australian investment relationship, how the US is the #1 foreign investor into Australia and the #1 destination of Australian investment. And why is that? And I think Robert touched on that in terms of some of the advantages of why Australians go to the US, but why do Americans come here? And there are advantages as well. And talking about what sort of unique advantages Australia has, I think one thing that is not really mentioned is the fact that Australia has a really high tech adoption rate. If you talk to a Cisco or a Google or any of these tech firms, the middle class here, the educated middle class here, is more sizable than it is in the US. You have sort of a larger population in the US that doesn't have internet access compared to here. And that is a natural advantage where you can basically get a whole market to adopt a new technology way faster than basically anywhere else in the world. Now, in terms of the disadvantages, Australia, as Robert said, is expensive for labor. And one firm told me as soon as something touches an Australian laborer's hands, the price of that product goes up exponentially. I think that was a bit of a hyperbole, but it is a challenge. But with that said, the Australian educational attainment here is pretty significant, and the R&D that you can do here, the engineers here are world class, and in some ways actually cheaper than in the US. So that's another advantage for Australia. Now, what is New Zealand doing? New Zealand has some natural advantages. It's smaller, and that's what I mentioned before in terms of New Zealand, Israel, and Netherlands. They're all smaller, and that means when you own that market, when you own the Israeli or the Dutch or the Kiwi market, people are like, okay, yes, and what? Whereas I think there's a bit of a concept here where you own the Australian market, or your market share is great here, and the size of Australia, both is population and landmass, is so much larger than these countries that people become maybe a bit complacent, and they're like, oh, okay, I got the Australian market. That's pretty huge. Look at a globe. That's all me. You know, I got 90% market share in Australia. Whereas you look at the Netherlands, and it's one little tiny part of Europe or Israel, et cetera. And so I think New Zealand is more. There's more world focus because they're smaller. And then also the government is smaller as well, and there's less layers of bureaucracy there, so you can sort of cross into the international realm a bit faster. That's just some of the many takeaways from New Zealand.
Thanks for that, Jared. I wonder whether the others would like to make comment on that. I know, Amelia, you've had some experience in Asia too, and I'll open up to each of you whether you'd like to make some comment around, how should Australia think differently, I suppose. And you've obviously, Royce, had some experience yourself with the development of some of the deer technology, which the idea and concept originated here, but you've had to sort of sell that back to your company in the States. So,
Yeah, and Jared brought up a good point with our education here. Most of our best engineers are educated here at ANU. We've just sent 2 of them over to the States to work at head office.
yeah.
So we're not slack in that department. And another thing someone brought up the other day is, and I know John Deere do it, it's a partnership between a company that's developing technology and a university. That is paramount to our success, and one of the reasons we went to AIMS is Iowa State University. I know John Deere get a lot of benefits out of Iowa State University. And that's something, when you're developing technology, and we've got 6 or 8 developers, you need good access to that sort of tertiary education. But we have good tertiary education here. Yeah.
It's sadly actually a good friend of mine, Graham Quick, who sadly passed away. He was actually the head of the engineering group at Iowa State University for many years, and again, Australian innovation sort of showing some leadership there. Would you like to make any comment, Amelia?
I thought it was interesting yesterday that one of the speakers made the point that, and I'd be interested in Jared's thoughts as well, to attract foreign direct investment from VCs, that Australian agtech startups almost need to be born global because the domestic market here isn't sufficient for them to be able to get that 7 to 10 year close that they're looking for. Yeah. And it's, you mentioned that we have been doing a bit of work in Asia. We have an office up there. We do see a fair degree of similarity in the types of challenges that major agribusinesses in the region are having. We've been having conversations with Sime Darby about their waste challenges, and we're working on very similar problems here. So there is scope for Australian agtech startups to be looking at how can technologies that they've developed for the Australian market be transferred up into Asia, but I don't think that many of them at this stage are starting out with that mindset. But I think increasingly, if we want to tap into international investment, that is the way forward.
Yeah. Would you like to make a comment, Royce? Otherwise, we'll go to our next question.
That's all right. Just on the innovation between Australia and New Zealand, from my personal experience, I think growers in both countries are very innovative. They do things that are driving their business, their requirements and their environment. So I guess the only difference that I see is some of the scales of the environmental impacts that actually operate between the 2 countries. But in terms of more innovative or not more innovative, I just say they're both very innovative.
Yeah, fantastic. We have a question here from the floor.
Sure, Paul Wood from Dairy Australia. So it's probably a bit of a challenge to Jared, because when I read your report, I couldn't work out why it didn't gel with my knowledge of having been in the field of commercialising ag tech for a long time. And fundamentally, I think it's because you asked the wrong question. The question really in Australia is, how do we commercialise ag tech? Venture capital has never been our preferred option, and it's still not. So we commercialise by direct. Zoetis, when I was at Zoetis, we spent tens of millions of dollars working directly with groups. We heard about Bayer yesterday. We've got through the RDCs, dairy, we directly fund, but in partnership with a company. The donor, MLA donor. So, unfortunately, when you read it, some people work out and say, look, we do this really badly. Yes, we don't do venture capital, and we probably could do more, so don't let me. But my general rule in advising anyone is don't touch venture capital unless you really have to. It's not the best route generally to commercialise unless you really need the capital. So often, and CSIRO's preferred model, you go direct to the people who are often dominating the field, because they've got a faster potential to get out there. If you want to do machinery, you go to people like John Deere. Otherwise, you're spending a lot of time on the sidelines. So I think, your answer for the question you asked is right, but it doesn't reflect the investment in the commercialising of ag tech in Australia.
Yeah, I mean, the title of the report is venture capital. You're right. That was the question we asked. And we took that approach because we were looking at Australia's peers. We were looking at the New Zealand's, Holland's, the Israel's, and seeing how venture capital in ag tech in particular was pretty sizable there compared to Australia. And the question is, how do you scale fast? And I think I don't disagree with anything you said. John Deere is a great way to go in terms of partnership, and Australia definitely does have some great RDCs. I don't think it precludes VCs, and I think, or it precludes wanting to approach VCs, and I think our view is that VCs is the way that you scale globally and you become a more of a global player. But again, that doesn't mean that that's the only route.
Can I comment on VCs? Because I didn't have time to do it. We've had quite a lot of experience in VCs, and they cost us a lot of money and a lot of time. In America, it was probably the best experience. We got right down to the wire of actually just about getting the funds. And first problem we had with VCs with our product was the lack of knowledge of the VCs of agriculture.
Yeah.
They didn't have very much, like if you gave them a drench gun and put them in a mob of sheep, you'd be 50% chance that it'd go in the wrong end. Like, they know nothing about agriculture. But one thing that annoyed us with VCs, at our experience, is that they wanted control. The first thing they wanted to do was change our management structure, which was going to cost us about $600,000 a year, because they wanted to put in specialist marketing managers and specialist sales managers and special production managers. And then they said, oh no, your board's not good enough. So they wanted to parachute trophy directors in, which would give the company a high profile. And the idea was that they wanted to dress the company up, so in 5 or 10 years' time, they could flog it off. And that's the impression we got of VCs in America. And one of those VC companies is actually the principals on the board of the CSIRO. So we thought being an Aussie, he might understand us a bit better, but it was the same story with all of them.
Yeah, certainly there's some investment challenges. In fact, I think it was yourself, Roy, said Australia is good at adopting technology. Like, Australian producers are very quick to understand what the value proposition is, or value how they can integrate it into their business. And I wonder whether one of the opportunities we also have here in Australia is to, I suppose, incubate the early stage commercialisation. Because we are a small market, it's equally cheap. It must be quite a challenge for a company like John Deere to roll out technology across the US, just in terms of just sheer cost and volume, whereas Australia being a smaller market, and a high rate of adoption of good sound technology makes it an easier prospect for early stage implementation. Royce, do you have any comment about whether what opportunities does Australia offer to companies developing ag tech that are looking to build their business here? And I might go to you, Robert, because afterwards.
Sorry, I just got a text from my son. He just had a meeting with a group of VCs, and he said half of them don't know the horse's head from the horse's arse, and that just come from me from the States. So sorry, I missed your question.
That's all right. We'll go to Royce first, and we'll see if we've got more questions.
No, I think one of the big things that I've recognised within, say, Australian agriculture and also New Zealand is the fact that the growers are typically very, very aware of the global market and the drivers and the influences that actually influence their profitability and decision making. And so that probably generates some quite unique drivers from a innovation point of view. Wanting to have that information available or that product feature available now to actually make sure that I can actually capitalise on that market going forward. So that's one significant challenge, that that speed requirement to actually take advantage of that market opportunity.
Fantastic. We have a question here from the floor.
Yeah, it's David Campbell here, Rowan.
Oh, g'day, David.
Agribusiness Freelance. So a bit of a reality bites question for Jared and Amelia, picking up on your initial question, Rowan, and then on Paul's question. after 20 years in my first part of my career in Monsanto developing Roundup and ag biotech in the very early days, 35 plus years ago, and in Pivot in the late 90s and working with people like Rowan in South Australia, we did the first yield mapping in Australia. And it's great to see now what's happened, 25 years later with the technology. But I spent about 7 or 8 years then in biotech, commercialisation out of our universities, and then in startup companies and globally in biotech. And what was very obvious, I guess, from my first experience of 20 years in agriculture technologies and then in the biotech space was where we fit in the global supply chain with what we develop here, whatever it is. And all of the discussion just about VCs I would agree with. I've danced with them here and in the US and in Europe. And you've got to figure out how to dance. So I really enjoyed your presentation, Jared, because it was a real reality bite sort of presentation on what goes on in the supply chain when you actually try and develop and take your technology, whatever it is. We have a nascent ag tech industry here at Evoke Ag a couple of weeks ago, and just listening here today and yesterday. It reminds me very much of our initial biotech industry here that was developed 20, 25 years ago. And the mistakes we made. Are we learning from what they did there? We had a lot of startups, they failed. We've had a lot of technologies that have found their way into global supply chains which are not products. They are enabling technologies. I spent 2 years selling stem cell assays to pharmaceutical companies for drug development, stuff that came out of Melbourne and out of Edinburgh. Have we got our head around what our future industry looks like, where the value can really be created and captured, rather than just sort of running headlong into startups, incubators, dancing with VCs, all that sort of stuff? Can we step back now and learn from some of the other industries such that we don't take the same time they have to realise whatever the potential is? And if we can, what do we have to do? What are some of the things we can do now in this nascent stage that helps us actually get there a hell of a lot faster than it took the biotech industry? I first got involved with biotech in 1982 in Monsanto when the Australian Biotech Association was formed. It took another 30 years to see the biotech industry realise its potential. We haven't got that long in ag tech if we want to achieve the targets we talked about earlier this morning. So I'll throw that one back to you. A real reality bites question.
Thanks, David. That's going to be a challenging response. Who would like to have
I've spoken a lot, so I'll
Okay.
defer to you.
Jared.
That's an interesting one. I think, I guess, if I rephrase your question as I've understood it, it's around whether or not potentially our role is in enabling or technology rather than in end-use technology. And I guess, have I construed what you're asking correctly?
Yeah, it's not one or the other, is it a mix?
Yeah.
And we get the mix right with whatever we have and whatever the value proposition is. If you can have a product in a company like we have with Automed, fantastic. And Aegisons are trying to do that with their technology. But if we can't, then how else do we take part in someone else's value chain and get a share of the global action, which is what the business is all about?
Yep. And so I guess that's how I was going to come at answering the question, was that I think that it is a mix. I think that there are opportunities for companies to develop an end product, but I think also, and increasingly in the relationships that we're developing in Southeast Asia, I think that the opportunity in taking Australian ag tech out is more often in working with a large global or regional agribusiness to provide a service which would then form the basis of something that would form part of their suite of technologies that they would commercialise. So I think it's a really interesting question. I don't think we have the answer as yet. Can we learn from other sectors like biotechnology? I think absolutely, and I think that learning process is in play right now.
Yeah. Anyone else like to make comment?
Do you want me to?
You go
if
for
you
it,
have time?
Jared, if you'd like to make
Yeah, I think, just to reiterate, hit it over the head a million times, but it's that global focus that I think is critical. There is a sense here that Australia needs to be more innovative, and I completely agree, Australia needs to be more innovative. It also already has some really great advantages and needs to use them. That said, innovation doesn't happen in one little world, one little like spot on a map. It's a global thing now more than ever. So I don't think we can answer that question yet, because when you look at where innovations have come from in the past, it's a global process. I mean, Australia, one major advantage is the follow the sun model, whereas you can have major R&D happening 24 hours a day by having R&D headquarters in Europe, Australia, and the US. So Australia can take advantage of that. That's just one of many advantages Australia can use. So I think it's that global mentality. And unfortunately, a lot of in my opinion, the discussion about innovation in Australia is a bit too Australia focused, instead of saying how can we just be part of the broader innovation world. Australia is, we need to innovate here, and we don't want this other innovation. We don't want to give it away to other countries, but no, you're not giving it away. It's just a partnership. It's a collaboration. This is something that's happening around the world, as Robert just showed very clearly, that you partner with folks in the US, and all of a sudden Australians are being innovators. And I think that's a perfect case study for Australia's future.
It's certainly one of the great strengths we have in Australia. I think Australian producers are like sponges. They absorb every technology that's available to us, and Australian producers are great filters of new technologies, and once they figure out the value proposition for it, the adoption rates are enormous. We've got some of the highest rates of adoption of auto steer and precision ag and no-till and these sorts of systems of anywhere in the world, so it's real encouraging. Look, I'd like to thank Amelia Fifield, Jared Monshine, and Robert Edwards and Roy Spell for your presentations today, and please join me in thanking our speakers.